Hi guys. Today I'm going to be demonstrating how to, well, I mean, you've read the title. I'm going to be demonstrating how to program a control panel, or, yeah, like a control panel for ride sims, or even No Limits 2, just anything you can apply it to really, or really any game. I'm just using No Limits 2 as a bit of an example here. I got this idea yesterday because, well, you deal with pricks online, and there's just some certain people spreading some false stuff about me, which isn't necessarily true, and it really sort of put me down in the dumps. And so I thought, I was thinking of ways to put my mind off of it, and I thought, you know what, I'm getting a lot of questions recently how to actually program these panels, and because I mean the fabrication side of things, there's great tutorials on YouTube. But the actual programming side of things, it's really not that great. No, you do get some good tutorials, but it's just I think I can explain things in my own way to try and help people understand. And even if you have no programming experience, hopefully by the end of this video you'll be able to actually program one of these panels. Today we are going to be programming this panel here. It's got just a key switch by there, and you can use that just as like a sort of panel enable thing. We've got an e-stop, it's a twist reset mushroom, and here we've just got some normally open, that's a normally open reset switch, dual dispatch. We have some just regular function stuff for like gates, floors, flying carts if you need to, and also a gate switch there. And so this has got, for your information, an Arduino Leonardo in it, and you need to use Leonardos specifically because I mean, here I've got a bit of an Uno, right? This is an Arduino Uno, and because of the types of chips on these, you can't use the keyboard.h library. And now the keyboard.h library is, you'll explain that it might sound, if it sounds like gibberish to you so far, just don't worry, it'll all make sense. The keyboard.h library is what we use on those chips to program these panels essentially and make them work with stuff like No Limits 2. And also RS and pretty much any game, even stuff like Kerbal Space Program, you can do it for stuff like that. So yeah, without further ado, I'm just going to switch the camera around onto a bit of a flatter surface so I can demonstrate maybe how this is wired first, and we'll get started from there. Right, so apologies if the focus here is a bit naff, but I can't really do much about that. It's just the phone I'm using. Anyways, let's actually, I probably could get that focused a little bit better, couldn't I? Oh, there we go, that's a bit better. I'm just going to demonstrate how this panel here, which I just showed you in the previous clip, is actually wired up. So let's say you have your Arduino chip here. So just your Arduino chip. Then you have, let's say this is the USB cable, and that will go off to your computer, right? Apologies for the shoddy handwriting, I'm sort of trying to do this through a camera. So that's your USB cable, which goes into the Arduino. This goes off to your computer. And here, I'm just going to use this for one switch. Let's say here, you're going to have your ground. So you'll have your ground pin. It'll be labeled GND on the Arduino. And here, let's just make this. You'll have this connected up to usually one, depending on the amount of buttons you have. Sometimes you need to use both ground pins, but I'll just use one here. So let's say for pin 2, you'll have a switch, and this will connect right up to the ground pin here. So this switch, I'll just shift this over just a tiny bit. So this switch here, we'll just say this is your dispatch button, right? And then you can have maybe like another one, and you can have that just for something else, and this will just also go around, and it'll just connect up to the ground right there. So that other switch up there, God, I need to shift this back up a little bit. Again, sorry for how this is all dodgy and everything. Essentially, these two switches, we're going to write code onto the Arduino so that when this switch is closed, it creates an electrical circuit, it goes around to the ground, and the Arduino recognizes this, it'll read this pin, and then if electricity is flowing through it, we'll program this chip to send maybe a keystroke through the USB cable and off to your computer. And so this is essentially how the whole panels work. They essentially work on the premise that they are just fancy keyboards. So you can just, it's literally just converting these button presses on the panel into what is essentially just keyboard presses, which you can assign any key you like. You can assign any sort of any key, any combination. You can program it to have a delay. You can maybe press one button and then make it press one key and then wait a few seconds and then press another one. You can program these to do absolutely anything you want. So I'm just going to basically hop onto my computer and show you the programming side of things now.
Okay, and welcome. Here I am. I've switched over to my computer. The microphone quality probably isn't as good, so I do apologize for that. But anyways, I'm just going to assume that you've already downloaded the Arduino Integrated Development Environment, or IDE for short. This is, you can use other IDEs. I'd prefer to use Visual Studio Code. It's just a bit better than the default Arduino IDE. But I'm just going to assume that most people have this. Since it's just the easiest to install. It's for the most part easier to use, and it's designed for Arduinos, so I'm just going to assume that people have this. The first thing you want to do before starting is to plug in your Arduino and make sure that, well, first of all, it's recognized in this little port section here. So I've got COM7, so Arduino Leonardo, and you want to have that selected with that little tick box. And your board, you want to switch this. It might be on Arduino Uno by default. But you want to switch this over to the Arduino Leonardo, since that's what we're working with. Okay, so the first thing you should do is do #include keyboard.h. This is the keyboards library which I was talking about. This is what we will be using to essentially interpret those buttons being pressed into the Arduino, allowing that flow of electricity into actually producing key presses and keystrokes on a keyboard. So you want this library. That's absolutely important. We need to declare some variables first. You need to make sure that your buttons are wired up and that you know which buttons are wired up to where. So I know that, for example, let's just program in dispatch, right? So we want to do constant int. You want to use constant because these integers for the pin buttons will never change. So we don't want to accidentally change them in the code or anything like that. You want to keep them constant. So I want to say constant int. We're going to call this dispatch 1. And we're going to assign that to pin 2, since that's the pin I've connected up to on the board. Yours might be different. And that's what we're going to do. We're just going to assign this to dispatch 2. And so now in here in the void setup, this is the code which will just run once. This is the code where when you plug in your Arduino, anything in this section here, in this function, will run once. So this is to use stuff like initialize pin modes and that sort of stuff. And then in the void loop, this is what can always run once your void setups run. This is what will always run. It will just loop over and over and over again. Right, so in void setup, what we need to do is we need to determine the pin mode, and we need to determine the pin mode of dispatch 1 to input _ pull-up. And you might be thinking, well, why don't you use just input? Because you can just use input like that, but there's a very good reason not to, and the reason why is because it can actually burn out your Arduino if you haven't put a resistor in between the button and your ground. So essentially, if you're not using a resistor, there's just an electrical flow which is going out of the 5 volts on the Arduino, and it's essentially just going straight back in with no resistance. And so essentially, after a while, it'll just burn out your board and it'll completely fry it. So we don't want that. So input _ pull-up, it actually uses the built-in resistor which is on the Arduino board, so it stops you from needing to implement any resistors or anything like that yourself. You can just use the one which is included on the board, and this will work absolutely fine and it won't burn out your chip. So we want to determine dispatch 1 as input _ pull-up. If you want to use stuff like output, then you'd use output for if you were coding in a light or a pilot lamp, but because this is an input, it takes in, we want it to recognize a signal. We want to put this as input _ pull-up. And what we want to do just underneath that is we want to type keyboard.begin. This will just create a keyboard instance. So then we can use this to essentially, how can I phrase this? To allow us to actually implement the keystrokes through the Arduino and into your code, into your computer. Sorry. Right. So now in the void loop, what we want to do is we just want to essentially put these statements in here. We want to say if, and we want to digital read the dispatch pin here. And we want to see if that is low. So if it's low, then this means that you've pressed the button down. It's a normally open contact, which means that whilst the button is just sitting there, you're not pressing it. There's no electrical connection. There's no electrical flow which can possibly get through. If you set it as high, you'd set it to high if it's something like a normally closed one. So maybe most e-stop buttons, they come with a normally closed contact. So there's always contact until you press that button down and then it breaks the contact. But we're going to use low here because one of the dispatch buttons I've got is it's normally open. I want to close off that those brackets there. And what we want to do is we're going to call in a dispatch function. Now this function doesn't exist yet, but we will create it now. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to just create a dispatch function. So we're going to do void dispatch. And in here, what we're going to do, this is just essentially this function here, this void dispatch, is what's going to be called whenever this digital reads as low. So whenever this is pressed, this function gets called, it goes to here and runs the code inside here. Void dispatch will only be run if it's actually called. Void setup and void loop will just run as soon as you plug the Arduino in. Okay, so void dispatch, what we're going to do is we're just essentially going to press, we're going to do keyboard. There's a few ways you can do this. You can use keyboard.press. You can do keyboard.println. You can use .print. I'm just going to do .print simply because it's just a bit easier than keyboard.press. Because if you do keyboard.press, then you have to do keyboard.release down at the bottom by there, and you can do it, but it's just I prefer not to. So what we're going to do is we're going to do keyboard.press, and let's say you've assigned your dispatch function. I'm just going to assume is the let's say the comma button on your keyboard, and so we can close that. And then here we're just going to press that, and we're going to put in a delay here of 1000 milliseconds. So that's 1 second. So essentially, when this function gets called, it'll go to keyboard.press this comma button. You can assign this to whatever you want. You can put it to a dot, you can put it to an open square bracket, you can do absolutely anything you want. However your no limits to is configured, or you can reconfigure your no limits to keybinds for this to work. So keyboard.press that, then it waits a second, and then it'll go back to the void loop, so then you can start pressing buttons again. Right, so this should work. I'm just going to verify this and make sure there's no errors. And save it, of course. I'm just going to verify this, make sure there's no errors, and then I'll hopefully be able to upload it to the board. And there we go. So it's compiled, and it's compiled with no errors. That's always good. And now we can upload this. And there we go, it's uploaded with no issues at all. So what I'm going to do now is just to demo this, I'm just going to open up Notepad, and I'm just going to press the green button on my panel. Right. Apologies, guys. I made that mistake there where I did keyboard.press and I forgot to do keyboard.release. I meant to write keyboard.print. So there we go, keyboard.print, that comma. Let's try and upload this and see if it works now. And let's just open up Notepad. Okay, so it seems to have uploaded just fine. Let's press the green button, and there we go. You can see it's pressed comma in, and it waits a second. The reason why we have that delay is so that when you hold it down, it doesn't just spam. So you can hold it down like this, and it'll just keep on pressing commas. As soon as I let it go, it does that. So, you know, you can just keep on going with this. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you how to program in a dual dispatch. Since I think a lot of people probably wonder about how to do dual dispatch. It's more realistic to have that have a dual dispatch. Okay, so here we go. What we're going to do is we're just going to, because if you noticed I had 2 green buttons, so I can use both of those as a dual dispatch. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do constant integer, and I'm going to say dispatch 2. And I'm going to assign this to pin 3, because that's the ones I've connected it up with on my board. And of course we need to declare the pin mode in setup. So we're going to do pin mode. Oh, if I can type properly, that might help. Christ, Finn, get grip. Here we go. Dispatch. Apologies for that. Input underscore pullup, just like the one above. And here what we can do now is we can just, well, essentially just write in the logic for this to work. So we can say that if digital read that is low, and what we can do is we can use and. So this will only enable if the second statement is also true. So we can do digital read dispatch 2 as, and we want to read that as low, because it's exactly the same button. It's connected up with the normally open contact. And so here we'll say if digital read this is low and digital dispatch 2 is low. So this will only run this dispatch function if both are pressed. So let's just upload this. Hopefully it doesn't spit up any errors. I don't think it will. And excellent, there we go. So now let's open up Notepad. So I can press one button. I'm pressing that green button there, doesn't do anything. I'm pressing the other one alone, doesn't do anything. But when I press both at the same time, you can see that it presses the comma. And that works like an absolute charm. So that's how you do a dual dispatch. It's quite simple. And yeah. Okay, so next up what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to write in logic for maybe a switch or a button. So the difficulty with many buttons is that they don't come latching. So it'll just have, you'll have this, like I've got a yellow button here, which I can use for restraints. And so the restraints button there, which I've programmed in, I've got set to, I believe, hopefully this is right, I've got it as pin 5. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do, let's say restraints as, we're going to equal that to 5. I'm hoping that's right, and I'm hoping I'm not going to make myself look like a tosser here. Here we go, pin mode, and we want to just say restraints. Now the difficulty with this is that you need an extra variable, and you need what's called a boolean. Now a boolean, in case you don't know, is essentially it's just a true or false statement. So it can either be true or false, 1 or 0, on or off, yes or no. So what we're going to do is we're going to do we're going to create a boolean, and we're going to do restraints open, and we're going to say that's equal to false, because by default you'll probably get a coaster which would have closed restraints. And so we want to just set that to false. You don't want this to be constant because this will change, so you just want to leave it as a regular boolean. Now, here, what we're going to do is we're going to write in, we're going to need 2 functions, but for the time being, what we're going to do is we're going to do if digital read, and we're going to say restraints, and we're going to say if that is low, and if digital, apologies for that, if res open is equal to false. And so here we go. So what this will do, this will only enable if the boolean is false and the button's been pressed. So what this will do now is we'll call a function called open restraints. We haven't written this in yet, but we'll write it in now. So now void open restraints. And so here what we're going to do is we're going to do keyboard, if I can type, keyboard.write, and we're going to, what's we going to press? Let's say the open square bracket key. That's a good example. Right, so this will keyboard.write the open square bracket key. And now what we want to do is we want to set this res open, and we want to say this is equal to true now. You'll see why we're doing this in a second. And of course we want to put a delay of 1000. You can set the delay to anything you want. I'm just using 1000 as an example so that it doesn't spam your keyboard. So there we go, delay 1000. And now what we're going to do is, this is great. So now if digital read restraints low, right, and the res open, so restraints open is false, so when they're closed, we want to open the restraints. So it'll call this function. It'll press this square bracket here, this open square bracket, which hopefully will open the restraints. Let me just zoom in, probably make that a bit easier to see. So this will open up the restraints here, and then res open equals true. That's great. Open it sets the restraints to open as true because it is, and then it delays of 1000 and then goes back to the void loop. So this is great. So now what if we want to close them? Because ideally we want to be able to open and close them with the same button. And so this is why we have this logic here with the boolean. So now what we can do is we can do if digital read restraints as equal to low. So if they're on, right, and we can say res open equals to true. And so now this will only enable if the res open is equal to true. So once you press this once and the restraints are open, this will not, this function here, no, this if statement will not be called because the boolean's been set to true. And so here what we can do is we can just say close restraints, and we'll create that function now. So we can just do void close restraints. And now what we want to do is just do keyboard.write, and we want to say close square bracket, right? That's a good example. Keep everything uniform. And we want to say res open is equal to false, because you know the restraints aren't going to be open anymore, and so we can delay of 1000 just like above. Okay, so this is great. I'm just going to verify this. Make sure that, of course, always verify before you try and upload. So just to make sure, there we go. So it's done compiling, hasn't spit up any errors. That's always good. And it should upload any second now. There we go. And okay, so here we go. I've got my yellow button here on the panel. I'm going to press that, and you can see it presses the open square bracket. Now it's just in its regular idle state now, so I can try and press this. I can press other buttons. It's gone back to the void loop, right? So it can press. I can try and dispatch. The program won't let me, obviously, because it won't logically allow you to dispatch a train with restraints open. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to press the yellow button again, and you can see it puts in a close square bracket. And I can keep on doing this. I can even hold it down, and it will just do open, close, and it will never do anything else. So this is great. This is the logic which you'd use for opening and closing restraints. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to program in a gate switch. Gate switch, obviously, quite important. So what we're going to do is we're going to declare what pin we have our gate switch as. This is just like a regular selector switch. You can hear it. And I put this on the panel. You saw it earlier. It's just the same. It's basically the same as the yellow button, except it's normally it won't have electrical current flowing through it when it's pushed to the left, but as soon as it goes to the right, it will have constant electric flow through it. And so here we go. What I'm going to do is I'm going to declare the variable. So I'm going to do constant int, and we can say gates. I've got this as 4, and of course we want to just make sure we've got all this right again. We want to declare the pin mode as input underscore pullup. So we can do gates. And right, here we go. So now what we can do is we can do if digital read gates is equal to low, so when it's on, and what we want is if the gates open is equal to false. So I've got to create this gates variable. I'm just going to do that now. Let's do boolean, and we want to say that's equal to false. Why not? Okay, so if gates open is equal to false, it will enable this. We can say open gates, and of course we want to write this in as usual. Void open gates, and here we go. We want to do keyboard.write. If I can spell, that might help. And let's just say this. We can set this to let's say the semicolon key. That's a good example. So that'll press down the semicolon key when we want to open up the restraints, and we can say we want to set the boolean to true, So we want to do gates open is equal to true because the gates are open, and delay of 1000. Now we can do exactly the same thing once again. I'm just going to copy this because it's pretty much the same statement. Make sure it's all indented correctly. Makes your code a bit easier to read. So if gates is equal to high, so when it's now closed, so this is when we switch the switch back to the left, so it breaks the circuit, and so when it's high, you want to say gates open and gates open is equal to true. You want to do call a function called close gates, and we're going to write this function in now. We're going to do void close gates, and we're going to do keyboard dot write. I'm just going to use as an example here the pound sign, or the hash key, or whatever you want to call it. Okay, so keyboard.write the hash key. Then what we're going to do is do gates open to be equal to false, and then we're going to say delay 1000. So this should work. Let's just try and upload it. Hopefully I haven't made any errors. And there we go. Seems to have uploaded just fine. Right, so let's give this a go. So let's try and open up the gates, and you can see it presses a semicolon key. And you can still try and press these. You can obviously control the restraints no matter what. So I'm just showing that as an example. And now let's say I want to close the gates. I'll just press that, and oh, it's pressed a question mark. Oh, I believe this is because I am using a British keyboard. Let's maybe use a different key for trying to close the restraints. Right, so we open, we get a semicolon, that's great, and we close, and brilliant. Okay, we get a forward slash. We've made progress. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hop into No Limits 2 now, and I'm going to show you, well, I'm just going to show you how the whole thing works, and see if it works properly. Okay, brilliant. I've just realised I've been recording in a really shit resolution the entire time, but luckily I've zoomed in, and I think I've explained things quite well. So I apologise for that. But yeah, hopefully it should be fine. Anyways, here we are. We're in No Limits 2. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into the setup. And here we go, controls. This is what we want. So what we're going to do is we're just going to make sure everything is bound correctly. So here we go. Open harnesses. What we're going to do is we're just going to press that there to open our... Oh, you want to use the backspace to get rid of any keys which were in there originally. Oh wait, we want to close the harnesses now, don't we? Because we just opened them. Right, so there we go. Close harnesses, there's our square bracket. And to open them, there's our opening bracket. And to close the gates, we're just going to remove that. Switch that to the right, so we get our semicolon. And the close gates, what we're going to do is we're going to move that to the left. Disengage floor, blah blah blah, we don't have all that, I've just done a quick little example here. And now what we're going to do to dispatch, we're going to just press both buttons, and hopefully it should bind just fine. There we go, so we've got our comma. Right, so I'm just going to hop in and just load up something small, something which is a nice little test. Something which isn't too intensive. Right, so here we are, we're in No Limits 2. I've just loaded up one of the default parks, and yeah, I've had to re-record this segment already, so if it doesn't really make any sense in the editing or I've jumped or whatever, then do excuse it. Anyway, we're going to test out the panel now and see if it works. So first I'm just going to open up the restraints there, and that works absolutely fine. I'm going to close the restraints, also works absolutely fine. You can open up the gates, you can close the gates. Oh, of course, I should have demonstrated that. You can open up the gates and the restraints at the same time, obviously. And of course, you can close the restraints too. And let's say we want to dispatch, so this is our dual dispatch we coded in, so we can't press one or the other, you have to press both. And there we go, it dispatches the train. So, if you've learned something new today, I thank you very much for tuning in. I do appreciate people sort of, you know, uploading these sorts of videos, and I thought, you know, why not give it a try myself? If you want to learn how to build a panel like this, there are lots of great tutorials on YouTube by people like Jack Guy, who I'll put a link to in the description. But apart from that, thank you very much for watching, and see you later.